This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What in the hell's going on?
What the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on?
I don't know what the hell he's talking about.
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
What the hell's the matter with these guys?
We don't know what's going on.
What the hell's going on?
Who in God's name knows what it's all about?
Hi, I'm Danielle Plutko.
I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast. What the hell is going on? What, Mark? What the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on is the pro-Hamas left has taken over dozens of college campuses across the country. There are, I think,
77 encampments.
77 encampments across the country. In Columbia University, the other day, they ordered them to shut down their encampment, and the students, not only did they not shut down their encampment, they took over the main campus building. And by the way, can I say just an aside? If you were outraged by January 6th and you're not outraged by this, you're a hypocrite. Students marching into a campus building, breaking windows, taking over a school in support of terrorism. I mean, it's disgusting. And we all believe in the free speech. We all believe in the First Amendment. The First Amendment does not give you the right to break the law. The First Amendment does not give you the right to disrupt other people's education. The First Amendment is the right to speak and to assemble. They are violating the right of assembly of students who want to go to class. They are violating the First Amendment rights of assembly of students who want to attend their graduations. They are violating the First Amendment as much as they are supposedly embracing it. And these schools have to restore order on their campuses.
They're not interested. I mean, this is really, for me, been the great eye-opener. You know, I look at a lot of these students, even the most egregious among them, and there's no time in your life to be stupid like when you're young, you know? Whether you're drinking too much, you're sleeping around too much, you're trying drugs, you're hanging out with...
But enough about you, Danny.
Enough about me. Nah, look, that's the reality. And I'm disgusted by a lot of what I've seen. I'm disgusted by what I've seen coming out of the mouths of these self-righteous little assholes. But if I really want to lay the finger of blame, I have two places. The first is school administrators who are failing to enforce the law, in failing to enforce their school regulations. And I want to remind people, okay, these are private institutions. This is private property, right? So in fact, these schools have far more latitude about where and when people choose to gather, how they choose to gather, what they choose to say when they gather, than just some random person standing out in the middle of the public street. Okay, so that's number one.
Ironically, it's the public schools that are cracking down and pushing them out, because the police at the University of Texas, they're carrying them out in zip ties.
Oh my God! We'll give you guys a link to the picture of the cop in Texas picking up this girl bodily and hauling her out. Oh,
they're actually enforcing the law, because it's not just up to the college administrators; it's up to the government to do it.
Okay, that's
yes.
You're right, but still, college administrations are a picture of cowardice, of lack of principle, of lack of authority. They are a disgrace to the educational system in our country. That's number one. But number two, Mark, I got to say, you know, we've been talking about, you know, oh, the kids, this, that, and the other thing. Now, you know, my kids obviously have many criticisms of me as a parent. I just heard one of my kids say to me, literally before we got on to record this podcast, well, she said with regret, I would like to think that you would have learned. Well, I haven't. So there.
I endorse everything she said.
Exactly. Well, it was hilarious.
After 251 episodes, I would have think that you'd learn, Danny.
Yes, well, one would like to think that. But what the hell is wrong with the parents of these kids? That they feel that, first of all, They know nothing about history. Second of all, they know nothing about how to treat other people. Third of all, they know nothing about what it means to be a Jew or a Zionist in any way, and yet they have no compunction. It would be as if you and I suddenly decided to take on, I would say Zoroastrians because that's what came to mind, but actually I know what Zoroastrians are. But it is as if they are out there demonstrating because they don't like the way brain surgeons are doing their business, but they don't know fuck all about brain surgery. And part of it is that parents are not educating their children about how to be. And we see this left, right, and center. This culture of entitlement, this culture of certitude of knowledge, and this culture of believing that my rights and my views are more important than everybody else's. It is unbelievable.
I actually had I knew a guy in high school who was Zoroastrian, literally. So I knew a Zoroastrian. But look, I endorse 100% what you just said, and I add the other culprit in this: the faculty.
Yes,
The
100%.
what's the only thing that has been more disgusting to me than watching these pro-Hamas protesters taking over Columbia University is watching hundreds of Columbia faculty going out in solidarity with them. What is wrong with these people? These people are supposed to be educators. Why would you pay $500,000 to go to send your kid to Columbia and learn from these people? On what earth would you invest that kind of money in these people? It's the utter bankruptcy. This is the DEI ideology come to life, because this is all the oppressor versus oppressed. That the oppressed can do no wrong, including October 7th, and the oppressor can do no right. And by the way, the Jewish students on the campus, not just the state of Israel, not just Netanyahu, they're the oppressors. And so you can shout whatever you want at them. There was just a video on Twitter today of a woman in a kippah attacking a Jewish student with a taser. A taser. I mean, but that's okay. Where's the condemnation of that from the faculty? Where is the faculty standing in defense of the Jewish students on the campus who are being prevented from going to class? You got faculty canceling classes to go join the protests. If
That's
you don't
unbelievable.
want to teach, you should be fired.
That's
If
correct.
you don't want to study and you disrupt other people's right to study, you should be expelled. If you're a foreign student who is doing this in an American university on a student visa, you should be deported and your visa should be revoked. These are not hard decisions. This job of a university is to teach. It is not to be a venue for protest. And if you want to protest in addition to your studies, go right ahead in a peaceful way. But your job as a faculty member is to teach students, not to sit on a campus wearing an orange vest, arm in arm with people wearing Hamas bandanas and Hezbollah flags.
Yeah. There, round of applause for that outstanding rant, Mark. Listen, I want to stop for a second because I want to remind people we are forgetting where this all came from. Okay, now we know, and we've mentioned more than once during this podcast, that it is as if we pulled up a rock and all of this filth has crawled out, and that it was there long before October 7th. But I want to just remind everybody what spawned this on our college campuses this academic year, October 7th. The moment when a terrorist organization, 2,000 to 3,000 men, crossed over from Gaza into Israel, into undisputed Israeli territory, disputed only by Hamas and Columbia University, and murdered, raped, beheaded, tortured, kidnapped,
Burned alive.
1,300 men, women, and children because they were Jews. Okay, that's what happened,
Including more than 30 American citizens, by the way.
and that is what has spawned this movement. We have, in our outrage at watching the administrators and the students and the people who say from the river to the sea, and the people who say you should be the next target, and the people who say Hitler should have finished the job, and the people who say we need a final solution, and that's just a few of the lovely quotes that we've seen over the last week
Go back to
alone.
Poland.
Go back to Poland. Exactly. Love that one too. But we are so focused on that outrage that we have forgotten that these outrages have grown out of the worst assault on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. Just think about that for a second and ask yourself what has happened, not to the education, right? Not to the sense, but to the humanity of these people, that they are celebrating this murder. I can't think of anybody for whom I would celebrate such an assault. And yet we have tens of thousands of American educated elites celebrating what happened, wearing not just the keffiyeh, which is, serves as a face mask and as a sort of an alt rebel, sign, but carrying ISIS flags, carrying Hamas flags, wearing Hamas face masks. This is insanity. It's insanity.
It is, and I'll tell you the reason why it's happening and why it continues and why these students aren't backing down. And I hate to say this, it's Joe Biden's fault. And I'll tell you why. Because it's working. Okay? Because their goal is to stop the Israeli assault on Hamas. Their goal is to put is a ceasefire, right? Their goal is to stop the impending invasion of Rafah. And guess what? It's working. They are pressuring Biden, and Biden is in turn pressuring the Israeli government. Tony Blinken, our friend, is right now in the Middle East trying to stop Israel from launching an invasion of Rafah and trying to broker a ceasefire to stop this assault. So if you're a student protester, you know that there is a direct line from the conversations happening in the Middle East right now to the White House to the encampment at Columbia University, and you're saying it's working. Why should I stop? I'm having my intended effect. Biden is afraid of me. Biden thinks he's going to lose the election because of me. We are succeeding. Why should we stop? That's what's fueling these protests.
So I want to say something to our listeners. There are going to be some of you, and I think we have a nice and eclectic and diverse group of listeners. There are some of you who are going to say, oh, of course, mark that partisan. Of course, he's blaming Joe Biden. Let me just say, okay, we all blamed Donald Trump, right? For the creation of an environment in which people thought that it was okay to go out and march in Charlottesville. Also anti Semitic, by the way, but also anti everything else, right? We blamed Donald Trump and poured scorn and condemnation on him for his good people on both sides line, right? Now, what we have heard from the Biden administration, they put out one good statement that was written by somebody that was not Joseph Biden, right? When Joe Biden himself was asked, he couldn't bring himself to condemn these anti-Semites, these anti-Zionists, these bigots, and these violent offenders who were putting Jewish lives at risk in this country and upending our education system. He couldn't bring himself to condemn them without also mentioning the Palestinians, which to me is no different. Okay, so if we want to say, oh, it's outrageous to blame Joe Biden, no, it's not. Because if you are willing to blame Donald Trump for creating an environment in which Charlottesville could happen, then you have to blame Joe Biden for creating an environment in which this has happened. Charlottesville was one place where we saw this
77.
happen.
77 Charlottesville's happening right now.
Except it's not just 77, because there are tons of places where there aren't encampments, where Jewish students feel afraid, where there are outrageous things happening. It's all over the country. In Washington, D.C., we saw that George Washington University finally got to the place where they called the D.C. police, and the D.C. police refused to come because the D.C. government thought it would be bad for their image if they engaged the DC police in hauling off student demonstrators. I mean, we have lost our minds, and the authority of the White House is just MIA.
Put another way, if you condemned right-wing anti-Semitism, you have to condemn left-wing anti-Semitism with equal force. Just one other point I want to make before we get to our guest, which is there was a news story the other day that Brandeis University has extended its transfer deadline so that Jewish students who feel unsafe on their campuses have a safe place to study next fall. Can you imagine if Howard University had announced that it was extending its transfer deadline because Black students felt so unsafe on their campuses that they needed a friendly environment in which to study? the outrage would be, can you imagine if these protests were not against Jews, but they were saying, from sea to shining sea, America will be free of black people go back to Africa, instead of go back to Poland, go back to Africa. If these were the people from Charlottesville on these campuses doing these things, the Black Lives Matter would be mobilizing in a second, and everybody would be outraged by it. But because it's Jews and because many of them are white, it's not the same outrage. It's permissible discrimination. It's permissible, and I am sick and tired of it. There is a direct line between what's happening now and this whole DEI ideology that has enabled this movement. These people are Marxists. They're not just anti-Jewish. They're not just anti-Israel. They're anti-Jewish and they're anti-American. That's what this comes down to. This is just as anti-American as it is anti-Israel and anti-Jewish, and we've got to put a stop to it.
Amen. You said it right, Mark Thiessen. And now
Thank you.
for our guest, Adam Lehman. It's his first time with us, and I'm so happy he was able to join us. Adam Lehman is the president and CEO of Hillel International, which is the largest Jewish student organization in the world. He started his career at Skadden Arps, a well-known law firm, and spent 2 decades as an executive and an entrepreneur, including as a senior vice president at AOL. He was a Harry S. Truman Scholar at Dartmouth College and is a graduate of Harvard Law School. And notwithstanding those last two elite facts, is a real mention a good guy.
Here's our interview. Well, Adam, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's my pleasure to be here.
So the Columbia students were told to vacate the quad, and instead they took a building. There are protests breaking out on campuses all across the country. There are Jewish students at UCLA who are being prevented from literally walking to their classrooms by pro-Hamas protesters while campus security sits there like, lumps on a log, letting them do it. I mean, first of all, just tell us, you're talking to these Jewish students. What is it like to be a Jewish student on these campuses right now?
It is, for the most part, horrifying to be a Jewish student on campus right now. If we had talked even a month ago, I would have told you that we were seeing, as we were, unprecedented levels of anti-Semitism impacting Jewish students. Even at that point, we had more than 1,000 specific reported instances of harassment, of intimidation, of assault, 50 assaults even a month ago. So it was rough, but I would have also told you that many Jewish students, fortunately, were finding that there was still space on campus for them to express their identities, and many students were kind of getting through the year okay. At this moment, I was just at Columbia last week. Every single Jewish student I talked to is miserable, and understandably so. They have been even further attacked in so many instances in connection with these encampments, and they're now paying the price for students who are completely out of control, non-students, because we're seeing classes canceled. We're seeing, at least in the case of USC, a full graduation canceled. So this is impacting Jewish students. It's impacting students from other backgrounds. And it's really an embarrassment and an outrage.
It is an embarrassment and an outrage, not necessarily in that order, because obviously the indictment is not simply of the university administration. And we've seen it repeatedly before Congress that these people are part of the problem, not part of the solution. And I know that students are afraid. There's an expression that's come into use in the last couple of weeks that I think I saw first from the Met Police in the UK, which was an accusation of a man of being provocative while being quote unquote visibly Jewish. He was wearing a yarmulke or a kippah, and he was simply walking. He wasn't actually engaging with demonstrators, and the Met Police took him in. But this is a problem even for students who aren't quote unquote visibly Jewish. I feel like a Nazi when I say those words. Talk to us about your conversations with these students, how they're coping, where they think this comes from, what their options are.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think it's really important for your listeners and hopefully people more broadly to recognize the issues are issues of perception. I've been on the news, as you would expect, quite a bit recently, and I'll often get the comment, we understand that Jewish students may feel fearful in this moment, and it almost implies, well, they're just a little oversensitive or a little irrational. In talking to the Columbia students, again, from all different political perspectives, by the way, all different levels of religiosity. They are fearful because they have seen their fellow students who are visibly Jewish getting pushed. They have seen them being battered with a stick, as we saw at the very beginning on 10/8 at Columbia. They have seen online the student at Yale being stabbed in the eye with a Palestinian flagpole. They have heard words that are really kind of bone-chilling. You may have seen the sign Al-Qassam or Hamas's next targets pointing at Jewish counter-protesters, or the video that's now been widely released of one of the protest leaders at Columbia saying Zionists don't deserve to live. So the fear is real and the fear is understandable. As Jewish students, as you said, visibly Jewish or not, are encountering all of this hate, all of this vitriol, all of this intimidation, and all this invalidation. That's something I think people are also not always appreciating in an age where, in particular on university campuses, we do so much to celebrate people's right to express their identity. Jewish students whose identities include an affinity for Israel, who shockingly, right? We just went through Passover, where in a Passover Seder, you're referencing the role of Israel in Jewish theology, Jewish history, Jewish community that dates back thousands of years. So of course, many Jewish students see Israel as a part of their core Jewish identity. They are literally being silenced left and right from being able to express that identity fully. And it feels like often Jewish students are the only minority group that is pushed into that second-class status.
You mentioned this student leader in Columbia. His name is Kamani James, who said that Zionists don't deserve to live. He's now been barred from campus. He hasn't been expelled, as far as I know. Talk about that. But also, this video where he said these things was at a disciplinary hearing 4 months ago, and they did nothing about it back then. It's only because it got leaked to the media, and all of a sudden there was an outrage that they even did anything about it. And I just saw this morning that he's on campus outside the hall leading the protests still.
Yeah, it's the equivalent of when, people are saying out loud what they otherwise believed but weren't saying. I mean, of course, he literally said it out loud, but we only heard it because it got resurfaced in social media. This, again, is what is so disturbing and unsettling. So many Jewish students realize, wow, these people who are literally 2 doors down in my dorm think that I don't deserve to live, or hold this deep-seated hatred toward me because of my identity and belief. And again, that's just frightening. And as a society, we have got to figure out where this disease is coming from and how we address it, because it's obviously so much more pervasive than I think people realized.
I want to start with one of the hard questions that you just alluded to, because what gets pointed out but seems completely irrelevant is that the Jewish people are not spokespeople for the Netanyahu government, right? Now, as it happens, I am Jewish. I am completely comfortable with the Netanyahu government's policy in Gaza, as are, by the way, the vast mass of Israelis, right? They have other differences, but
well, Danny,
nonetheless,
can I correct you? It's not the Netanyahu government. It's a unity government.
yeah,
It's
but he's the
it's
prime
not.
minister.
Everybody always tries to put it on Netanyahu. He can't do anything without the opposition, who is in the unity government, signing off on it, right?
Right. But Mark, but the point I'm trying to make is this, if somebody turned around to black students and said, I cannot believe what's happening in Sudan or Nigeria, the connection may be slightly more tenuous, but not much. And what I'm trying to understand is, where has this come from? What is the wellspring?
Yeah, and I think it's really important, Danny, as you're doing, that we do name the fact that there is this enormous double standard where, on the one hand, Jewish students are being held responsible and accountable for the actions of foreign state and government, over which they hold no control. And number two, that now for decades, I mean, obviously it's, as intense as it's ever been, but for decades there's been this obsession with Israel as the source effectively of all evil in the world, which just fits back into classic anti-Semitic tropes. So when we talk about like, where does this come from? And I will just digress for a second and amplify your point. What about Chinese students? I mean, if they were held responsible for the actions of the Chinese government, it just would be so
COVID.
illogical.
Imagine.
Yeah, right. It would almost be laughable. And yet it's baked into the expectation of not only Jewish students, but others on campus that, of course, and again, this is just referencing something that's been reported to us hundreds of times. Of course, if you're a Jewish student, regardless of your views of the current government in Israel, regardless of how you might think about prosecuting a war in Gaza following the obscene atrocities of 10/7, you are walking down the street or walking into a Hillel for Shabbat dinner and called a baby killer. And so where it comes from, I would say, is a few spaces. Number one, as we define classic anti-Semitism, it is identifying what is evil in the world as emanating from Jews, and therefore focusing the correction on eliminating what is Jewish. And we've seen this play out over thousands of years, but in this context, what is the most visibly Jewish thing in the world today? The state of Israel. And so therefore, you channel that anti-Semitism into the elimination of the state of Israel. That, and of course we know it plays in perfectly with more meta intellectual or really anti-intellectual themes around oppression and so much else that is taught on campus. But I almost think it overstates the role of, for lack of a better word, woke ideology to give all the credit there. I think there's a much deeper strain of anti-Semitism that has just been activated in that way. And if I can, I'll use one other description of this, actually credit to Sarah Hurwitz, a former Obama speechwriter, who's really had an awakening during this period in terms of recognizing the way that anti-Semitism is plaguing not only campus, but broader parts of our society. And as she rightly points out, the framework for often executing anti-Semitism is discerning between the good Jews and the bad Jews. So if it was Spanish Inquisition, you could be saved and cured by giving up your Jewishness. If it was mid-20th century America, you could move from being like a dirty, disgusting Jew by, getting rid of your visible signs of Jewishness and assimilating. Today, the price of being a good Jew is hating Israel and admitting that Israel is in fact the source of evil in the world. So that's what students are up against. I think these deeper, frames of anti-Semitism are what we're facing. And again, I think we've got a long way to dig out.
What strikes me is not simply the existence of the anti-Semitism, but the tolerance of the anti-Semitism. So they're yelling at these students, go back to Poland, go back to Europe. They're saying from the river to the sea, Palestine would be free. Can you imagine what would happen if on a college campus today, there were white supremacists yelling at black students, go back to Africa? Or if they were saying from sea to shining sea, America will be free of black people. Can you imagine what Black Lives Matter would do with that? How long would those student encampments of white supremacists be allowed to exist? Why is it okay to say to Jews what would not be tolerated to being said to an African American?
Yeah, and this is where sometimes I feel like in these discussions, this is important and helpful coping for all of us because we're trying to wrap our rational brains around it. But we almost have to just accept the given because, again, it is so pervasive. Now, one of the things in accepting the given but addressing it that we can't do is just look to the law itself, right? So Title VI does not permit universities to allow these hostile and discriminatory environments where there is unequal treatment of Jewish students. And so really since 10/7, we have been aggressively advocating with the Department of Education and also working in partnership with other organizations to bring Title VI actions against universities. So even if we can't break the groupthink that allows for these obscene double standards and actual discrimination and harassment, we can at least hold universities accountable to do something about it. So that's one of the ways that this, again, getting to the deeper hearts and minds issue, I think is going to be even harder.
I want to talk more about what to do. So sort of put a pin in that question of Title VI and other options. But I want to talk a little bit more about the bad guys for a second. Viralness is very much a 21st century thing, whether it's, cats on the internet or it's, hilarious memes or whatever it is. It has been quite striking that Colombia, which to us is an execrable outrage of, an example of one of the worst kinds of bigotry we see in society today, amplified and and supported nicely, I saw, by Hamas and by the Islamic Republic of Iran. Like, go, kids, go. Yeah, we'd like to see those demonstrations take place in Gaza or in Iran. We know what happens to people who do that in Gaza and Iran, but I digress. One of the interesting things the Washington Post reported last week that there was a Zoom meeting, 200 students from different schools all around the country strategizing among themselves about how to replicate these Colombia in violent, bigoted encampments. How is that coming together? What is the force that is doing this? What is the role of Students for Justice in Palestine and their affiliated organizations? And I have a follow-up question, but I'll let you answer.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to comment quickly on your digression and then come back on the Students for Justice in Palestine piece. On the digression, is there not a really sad paradox in the fact that so many of these protesters are nominally calling for a ceasefire, by the way, as if it is only on Israel to execute and determine that ceasefire. And the mere fact of what they are doing is actually preventing and delaying a ceasefire, because we're seeing Iran and Hamas say, you guys are doing awesome on campus, keeping us from agreeing to what is already an overly generous ceasefire, when it comes to the number of prisoners who would be let out of Israeli prisons, just so, the poor souls who were abducted on October 7th can return to their country and their families, those at least who weren't slaughtered, and otherwise killed in Gaza. So that to me is a story that, again, it's kind of crazy to me. No one points out the paradox and sickness of that. Back to kind of how this happened, you often hear from people who say, oh, wow, look at these spontaneous demonstrations, spontaneous BS. There is an what I call an anti-Israel industrial complex, for those who remember, the old Dwight Eisenhower use of that frame, that has been established and locked in for 3 decades. And that is why, and it's been centered around this group, Students for Justice in Palestine, but that is why they are able to give a command and control implementation in this kind of example. If you simply, and this is the good part, you can simply go to the National Students for Justice in Palestine social media and see them calling plays. Okay, everybody, here's what we're going to do. It's what they did October 7th. I mean, eerily releasing their guidance, within hours of, the Hamas terrorist attacks and atrocities, with their playbook for undermining Israel and Jews on campus at that point. And we've seen it again with the encampments. One of the frustrating aspects of this is, Hillel is about supporting Jewish students through positive experiences, with Jewish ritual, with community building, with community service and all that. So we're not experts on tracking the flow of terrorist funding. So we do know that Students for Justice in Palestine is tied to a group, AMP, which is tied to another holding company, which is pulling in funding, which appears to be coming from the same sources that are funding Hamas and Hezbollah. But again, at Hillel, that's above our pay grade. What is not above our pay grade is being able to understand just how well funded, well orchestrated, and unfortunately, how effective these coordinated attempts and protests have been.
That's right. And I agree. That's not your pay grade. Right. Material support for terrorism and operating at the direction of a foreign government in the United States are, however, both against federal law. And that is where there's an interesting nexus that I ask myself, is the federal government involved? Have you talked to, as an organization that obviously is an interested party, have you talked to the FBI? Do you know if universities have talked to the FBI, which is tasked obviously with finding out this kind of thing. All the information that you've referred to, I've seen coming from organizations like ours, from newspapers, from various Middle East think tanks. I haven't seen the FBI on the scene anywhere. What's happening?
Yeah, great question. I actually testified in front of a congressional committee along with Jonathan Chanzer from the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, where he did lay out everything that they've discovered in terms of the flow of funds and in terms of the control structure. We have raised these concerns at that legislative level. We have raised these concerns at more administrative or regulatory levels. We have not seen any particular follow-up. What we do know is, and this is part of the story too that I think is important to tell, there are universities that are actually well-run and taking the issue seriously and executing effectively. So for example, Vanderbilt's definitely a wonderful best practice example of running a serious university, maintaining safety and positive conditions for students, and also with that, disciplining students and organizations that cross lines in ways that create safety issues and other risks for students. I was thinking in this example too of University of Florida, of Brandeis, of other schools that actually did kick off campus groups like Students for Justice in Palestine, in part based on the rationale that they appeared to be materially supporting terrorist organizations. Unfortunately, those kinds of examples are more the exception than the rule, particularly on that part of this equation. But I can hope that over time, as it becomes more and more apparent how coordinated all of this activity is, that we will see either real federal action prohibiting or making illegal activities being pursued by groups like SJP in coordination, or better public recognition of this. I mean, this is the other part of it that I feel does not get adequately reported in the mainstream media, which is so many, at least the leaders of these protest movements, are explicitly speaking from the playbook of Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran. They're admitting it. They're not, we are Hamas. They're waving the flags. They're using the talking points and language. And so at least let's call it for what it is. For Americans or university officials or students who believe that that is the way of life that they want to support and pursue, okay, at least we know who we're dealing with. But again, when you see this stuff reported either on the news or in other contexts, I feel like that part of the reality is being pushed underground.
So Americans were rightly outraged by the anti-Semitic protests in Charlottesville, right? Where a bunch of right-wing anti-Semites were marching with tiki torches, chanting, "Jews will not replace us." And they were rightly angry when Donald Trump said there were good people on both sides, and that phrase got taken out of context, but they attacked him for it, rightly so. Joe Biden just said that, well, I condemn the anti-Semitic protests, but I also condemn the other side who doesn't understand the suffering of the Palestinian people. So basically, bad people on both sides, response. It seems like with Democrats, there is a double standard when right-wing anti-Semites march, then they're right there to jump on and condemn it. But when it's left-wing anti-Semites, and right now there are dozens of Charlottesvilles happening on campuses across the country. Not only are there crickets chirping, you got AOC and these other people actually showing up, and Ilhan Omar showing up to support the Charlottesville marchers and Columbia and other places. What's going on with that?
It's even worse than that. I was so both offended, but also just demoralized seeing a U.S. Congresswoman, Ilhan Omar, talk about, under the guise of addressing anti-Semitism, talk about having both anti-genocide Jews and pro-genocide Jews. Going back to what I commented on earlier, that is just 100% straight ahead blood libel, right? Oh, right, there are these Jewish kids roaming around this campus who are those blood-sucking, bloodthirsty, let's go kill innocent people Jews. Really? Like that? And by the way, not that students shouldn't be able to have very diverse and radically different political views, but when I talk to Jewish students, and I do every day in this capacity, there's enormous empathy for Palestinians. We're not talking about an anti-Palestinian group. Has anyone ever seen a group of Jewish students get together and start chanting about "kill the Palestinians"?
Well, how about
no
from the river to the
here,
sea?
no
Israel shall conquer, right?
Yeah. The lack of parallelism, again, it's like the old John Lovitz in '88 on Saturday Night Live. I can't believe I'm losing to this guy. Like, how? How do people not get the fact that, the treatments here are so disparate? It's part of also, beyond just the recognition, is something we need to make sure at a wider understanding level that we create space for, which is Jewish students, Americans. For sure, you can be empathetic to Palestinians. It is really hard to see the impact of war in Gaza, just like the impact of war in so many other countries where civilians tragically are impacted. That does not then dictate what we hear from so many of these protesters, which is, and therefore, we should eliminate, often violently, the entire state of Israel, or we should discriminate against millions of Jews, both in Israel and elsewhere. Again, the leap there is not only logically unnecessary, it's obviously morally bankrupt.
We've talked a lot about, what we're seeing, about the fear, about the coordination, and we've talked a lot to other people. Very interestingly, to someone like Rui Teixeira, who's a colleague of ours, as Democrat can be, who has talked about the sort of Marxist absolutism. Well, if you are against climate change, you also have to be against Israel. That sort of linkage of all of the issues. But I have to tell you, I never believed that there were so many anti-Semites. I always knew there were some. We all know that, right? But I've never believed that there were so many, that anti-Semitism was so pervasive. Why? I know it's a dumb question, I know. But I mean, it is as if you were, it is as if you were living on a nuclear waste site, and you suddenly discovered when someone scratched away a thin layer of dirt that everything was irradiated. Where has this come from?
Yeah, we're asking the same questions ourselves. Again, what we do see is connectivity back to a lot of these ideologies that divide people into white or not white, oppressor and oppressed, and link causes that, whether logically linked or not, become the representation of what we've seen at some of these encampments, just the locking of arms to keep Jews out or keep out others who don't agree with their points of view. I think the best way I can answer it, Danny, is say we got a lot of homework to do as we come out of this phase to both assess the scope of the problem. There's a lot of data work happening. We're doing pulse surveys virtually every week at this point, and there's some other high-quality researchers like at NORC at the University of Chicago, also pursuing research that is showing the real depth of the issue, where 30% of students from non-Jewish backgrounds say they don't want to talk to or be friends with someone who's Jewish at this point because...
Are you kidding? 30%?
Yeah. And in fairness, this was research done by Professor Eitan Hirsch at Tufts. The 30 may have been a subsegment, but it was like a meaningful subsegment of students. And another data point I remember from that study is 77% of Jewish students surveyed indicate that they know they will pay a social and academic price just for expressing their Jewish identity and any affinity to Israel. So the breadth of the problem is real. Let's keep getting sharper on understanding who and what. I think we have to get into the segmentation of it. There are haters that the hate is so deep and so grounded in their core beliefs that it's more about containing, prosecuting where they are violating laws, and otherwise ostracizing them for discriminatory beliefs. There's another group of people who just seem to be under a spell that we have to break, and the question is, how do you break the spell? And then there's a large group that sits in the middle who, frankly, this is not their issue, this is not their fight.
They're sheep.
And we need to get them activated in a way where they understand, number one, why this is so problematic for students and other people being impacted, but number two, where they realize this, and this is what so many of us talk about, but this is the slippery slope. Like, their lives may feel just fine right now, but it ain't gonna feel fine when Iran topples the next two countries in the Middle East, and suddenly you've got, from the inside in the United States, a totally different radical ideology that's growing.
Can I jump in? It is their fight, okay? I'm sorry. When you see this evil in your midst, on your campus, you don't get to stay on the sidelines. I'm sorry. This is how the Holocaust happened. This is how, they say, well, it's just the Jews. It's not my fight. I'm sorry. It is your fight. You're an American. You're seeing hatred unfurling its ugly head in your midst. You don't get to sit on the sidelines. It is your fight. And I hope more people are realizing that it's their damn fight because, I'm not Jewish. I could say it's not my fight,
You're still a good boy,
but
Mark.
thank you. But, it is my fight because these are my brothers and sisters who are being targeted for their religion. And what if it happened to me? I'd want them to stand up for me. It's just, this is your damn. I'm sorry. Anybody who thinks this isn't your fight, it's your damn fight. Get off your ass. Sorry.
No, I love the passion and the articulation of it because candidly, if we could activate all of those students from other backgrounds who understand what's happening in front of them, who may realize, and sadly again, that they're going to pay a little bit of a price for speaking up, but get them to do so as allies, that's something that frankly has been sadly missing on a lot of campuses. And there are wonderful opportunities as we head towards graduation. We're trying to figure out how to better equip Jewish students and their families, but I think we should also be looking at, for so many other students and families, how can they show allyship in a way that when predictably a group of people are going to try to disrupt, try to take over graduations and turn them into political fodder in support of Hamas and some of these other groups and causes, how can they respond? So that's part of what we're working on right now.
So what I wanted to come back to is the fight, right? Mark has heard me rant about this before, as has our producer Ben. In the immediate aftermath of October 7th, I put together a huge what we need to do plan. But I'm not a domestic policy person. I'm not an anti-Semitism person. I'm a Middle East person and apparently a podcaster. It was enormously difficult to get organizations, even Jewish organizations, pro-Israel organizations, to engage in any meaningful way. I mean, I haven't given up, but and I'm still trying to write legislation about this. But the bottom line is, I want to hear more from you about what it is you think can be done. Okay, Title VI, right? That provides some options. The Higher Education Act and the requirement for disclosure of foreign funding has some options. Those are things already existing in law. How do you feel as an organization that is about Jewish life for these students? How do you feel about how the fight itself is going? Because it's not about protecting kids at graduation. You're not a security organization. You're not the police or the National Guard, right? It is the job of the state and the federal government to do these things. How is that activation, that fight going?
Yeah, I would say we're making some progress and there's a long way to go. And Danny, I would articulate a handful of really concrete and executable steps that governments can be taking, that administrations can be taking, and that all the rest of us in civil society can be taking. For starters, the federal government, state government, they actually need to do their job when it comes to enforcement of Title VI and other civil rights protections. There have been violations left, right, and center. And while I've frequently applauded the Department of Education for initiating investigations more quickly in this period, going back to 10-7, and Catherine Lehman, who oversees the Office of Civil Rights there, we're now getting to the point where we need to see actual results and outcomes from those investigations because litigation takes time, I know, and lawyers doing investigations takes time. But if we don't actually pull through to where we've got clear precedent around the outrageousness of not only the student behavior, but the insufficiency of the university response, universities are going to continue to be flaccid and actually not do their job. So number one, we need the actual throughput at that Title VI enforcement level. Number two, we probably do need legislation that actually gets at everything from the way that funding sources may be impacting the entire picture of higher education onto what so many other countries have, which is clear ways to delineate organizations within the country who are advancing terrorist causes and groups. So all of that, I think, can be pursued at the legislative level. I will say, too, people often don't see it, but we're coordinating with the Jewish Federations of North America, AJC, ADL, lots of other groups to try to advance that side of the equation at the government level. At the university level, universities need to follow the school you pointed out, Vanderbilt, and several others who are simply doing what strong and thoughtful administrators are capable of doing, which is preserving their institutions for actual higher education, not allowing the inmates to run the asylum, And that means enforcing policies with suspensions, with expulsions, if necessary. No one wants to see that. But when students, faculty, and staff are running roughshod over the basic rules and policies, you have no choice. And literally, you have no choice. You need to do it. And so many universities are not. Another really underbelly of this is with faculty of universities. They're ungovernable. They are the permanent residents on campus who have, in so many cases, bought a particular anti-Israel demonization, lock, stock, and barrel, and that gets spouted through their classrooms. We've had, even in this moment, so many students come to us and say, my professor just moved class to the encampment. I don't feel safe in the encampment. What am I supposed to do? Or my professor just canceled the last class before my physics final. I need to do well in this final, but he canceled because he said we all should go to the encampment. So we gotta...
What is wrong with these people?
I know.
They're anti-Semite.
Again, we're seeing this day after day, but you're right. It is batshit crazy, excuse my podcast language.
That's all right. We have an explicit rating. You're more than welcome to use it. They just showed video of the Columbia faculty linking arms, wearing orange vests, and linking arms to protect the students from the police in New York. I mean, who is paying $500,000 a year to get their kids indoctrinated by these idiots? Why would you send your kids to Columbia?
Number one. Number two, I don't need to be a free speech scholar to know something that apparently the faculty don't know. These students have enormous latitude in terms of free speech, as do faculty, but that doesn't mean you can violate every rule and policy, including reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. That doesn't mean you can harass students and assault students and speak in terms that are just so far beyond the pale and so far beyond the parameters of free speech. So we need an education boot camp in free speech for faculty. Moving on, though, because I do want to hit a few things, too, that, again, I think are actionable at that university level. We actually do need to sensitize and educate people around the nature of contemporary anti-Semitism. I think a lot of the people we've talked about who are not standing up as allies, who are frustrated by what they see, but they see it as problems on both sides, they need to understand why dehumanizing a Jewish student based on the blood libel is wrong and why that reflects discrimination and bias. So simply having all this infrastructure that's been created for DEI actually used to educate student bodies when it comes to the nature of contemporary anti-Semitism, that I think is going to be an important step forward. And then we do need, and I applaud, the Kraft Foundation and others who are trying to do more broader public education when it comes to the nature of contemporary anti-Semitism, because again, we have to name it. We have to shame it's the name, shame, claim. We have to name when these issues are bubbling up, shame folks who are engaged in such shameful and harmful behavior, and then reclaim space for an American society and an educational frame that actually does support all of the basic principles that are embedded within our Constitution and our traditions when it comes to education, but are not playing out on campus right now.
I want to ask you a last question, and it's a weird one, but I struggle with this. At the very beginning, when Mark and I started to talk about the anti-Semitism problem rearing its ugly head since October 7th, we had Ruth Weiss on. Ruth Weiss is a national treasure. I think we can all posit that as accepted. Ruth very crossly battered me down when I said that part of this has to be Holocaust education, because it seems to me that when students don't know anything about the Holocaust, and they don't, right, that this narrative of Jews as oppressors becomes even more prevalent. Ruth, not to put words in her mouth, basically said, no, I can't stand the idea that Jews are portrayed as weak, that we are the underdog, that we need to always say, oh, poor little Jews, look what the Germans did to us, feel sorry for us. I understand that. I understand how she feels. I actually don't think I do feel that way. Sorry, Ruth. Help me understand about the role of Holocaust education. My 8th grade teacher wrote the Holocaust curriculum in the 1980s, Facing History and Ourselves. Margot Strom. She was a great teacher. And what I see in schools, just based only on my own children, is that there's no Holocaust education at all. Is this something that matters? And yes, Hillel is actually a Jewish organization, and the Holocaust is a kind of a national and a Jewish event. Is this a part of it? Is it important? Should we be thinking about it?
I think it's really important, and I don't think it necessitates taking on the identity of weakness or subjugation of Jews. It's important to me for a couple reasons. One, we can't really sensitize non-Jews to the way in which current dehumanization and demonization of Israel and Jews ties back to literally thousands of years of anti-Semitic narratives and tropes if we don't actually bring that history to bear. And I don't think we can contextualize why having a strong Israel that is capable of defending itself in the face of attacks like what happened on 10/7, why that is so important for Jews and why that actually is in service of what we all should want in the Middle East and in the world. The Holocaust is part of that story. There is a reason why on March of the Living, you go from the death camps to Israel, because the story ultimately is a story of strength. And I, in terms of a wrapping up comment, even within what has been so frustrating, mind-blowing, hurtful, and hateful over this past year on campus, there's a lot of strength. We've had nearly 200,000 students engage with us at Hillel, which is the most ever in our 100-year history. I have rallied together with student leaders who would blow your mind because they are so passionate. They are so empathetic, but they're capable of expressing empathy in a way that does not negate their identities or their strength. And they're problem solvers, and they are going to carry us forward in terms of what they can do for the Jewish community. They are there to have the hard conversations on campus with people whose ideas are very different than their own. Unfortunately, they face anti-normalization, where groups like Students for Justice in Palestine literally won't talk to a so-called Zionist, God forbid someone who believes in the right of Jewish self-determination. But the bottom line is we've got some great young people. We're going to keep creating space for more to join that crew. And thank you guys for just bringing focus on this issue. Well, first of all, I just really appreciate the conversation, but would encourage anyone who hears this to, whether you support a Hillel, another Jewish organization, or otherwise just speak up. You're going to help us all cure what's so broken right now on campus.
Well, Adam, we're so grateful for all that you're doing to Broken on campus and to support these students. And I just encourage you and others to form, there should be like a Hillel adjacent group for like Friends of Israel and Friends of Jews, something to activate the allies in this cause, because I think a lot of people are coming face to face with evil for the first time, these young people. And this is going to be a transformative moment in ways that the pro-terrorist movement doesn't anticipate. And I applaud you for all you're doing to rise to this moment. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Right. Thank you. So, Mark, what'd you think?
Well, I want to pick up on what you said about the Holocaust and Ruth's critique of the answer is more Holocaust education. I, like you, respectfully disagree with her, and I'll tell you why. I think the reason we need to focus on the Holocaust is because it explains why Jews aren't putting up with this anymore. The answer is it's not portraying Jews as weak. It's explaining why they're strong now. It's explaining why Israel needs to exist. Jews are never going to depend on somebody else to defend them. They're going to be armed. They're going to protect themselves. They're not going to allow Hamas to do what it did on October 7th without taking care of it. And you see this in these college kids today, which I've just been so inspired by these Jewish kids on college campuses that are saying, in fact, I want to play a little clip, Ben will put in here, of some Jewish kids who, when I was on Fox yesterday, they cut in with a live interview with some of these Jewish kids and what they said.
Class where the rest of their students are allowed to be in class. That makes no sense. It's against America. This is against Western values. This is not just a Jewish problem. This is an American problem.
Are y'all all UT students?
Yes.
Yeah, I was just taking a final, and this is just an intimidation campaign. They're trying to scare Jews off campus. I'm trying to do my final, and in the background I hear they're chanting for the death of Israel, the death of Jews. It's completely unacceptable. If they want peace, they don't stand for anything like it. Israel is a democratic state. It's the only democracy in the Middle East. This is, at the end of the day, they don't want Jews on campus. They're trying to scare us off. They don't want us here.
Are you going to be scared off?
No, absolutely not. We will not follow our history. We will not be led like lambs to the slaughter.
What are your parents telling you? Finals are coming up next week. What are your parents telling you? Do you want to come back?
They're telling us to stay away, at least mine, and in my opinion, I'm going right into it. This is not a time, we have to be strong. History shows us that if we're strong, we can defend ourselves.
What are y'all's parents saying?
Just be safe, be careful, and be aware.
Are you going to come back? Do you want to be part of your team?
Of course.
Guys, your team?
We're not going anywhere. This whole thing is a huge scare tactic.
And you see what's happening at other campuses across the country. The administration's doing nothing. We are really blessed to be at a school where they are happy to send in a police force. They're happy to protect the rights of all students, not just Jewish students, anyone who might be at risk from protesters.
I heard other Jewish students today at a pro-Palestinian rally supporting this. What do you say to those classmates? Other Jewish students.
I think that to those Jewish students, it's definitely upsetting as a Jew because I think they're not educated. I personally have been to Israel 8 times. I've been on the border of Lebanon. I've been on the border of Gaza. I've seen this all firsthand, and I would love to just talk to them and say, what have you seen? Where have you been? Have you heard Holocaust survivors speak? Have you heard victims of terrorist attacks speak? I think they're they're misaligned, and it's a shame because they should be a part of the Jewish community that's there to support them.
You wanted to say something?
Yeah. Like in general, you have it's a very leftist, like people on the left, a huge LGBTQ population in that crowd. They have no idea what would happen if they were to step foot in Palestine. They'd be stoned and beheaded. Israel, in fact, is one of the only nations, I believe it's the only nation in the Middle East that supports LGBTQ people. I find it ridiculous that you have so many people in that crowd that are so ignorant of this fact.
These kids are such an inspiration. They're not backing down. They are not hiding off campus. They are demanding to go through the encampment, to go to their classes. They are. I think in UCLA they put up a projector showing the videos of October 7th that is playing and blasting into the encampments. The Jews are not going to take this anymore. They're not going to back down in the face of this stuff. And the reason why? The Holocaust. They're never going to let that happen again. They're never going to depend on other people for their security. They're never going to depend on other people to defend them. Jews are defending themselves these days, and they need us to support them while they defend themselves. That's the difference, and that's why you need to. The basis of all of it is what happened in the 1940s.
Yeah. Look, I mean, you know how I feel about this, Mark, and I think the thing that a lot of people fail to understand is how much of this existed before October 7th. You know,
we picked up a rock,
right?
And all the creepy crawlies came out.
I will tell you, you know, anti-Semitism and discrimination against Jews at universities is now so pervasive. I won't mention the university, but when one of my kids was applying, my husband, and you know, actually our listeners all know, Stephen is no Danny Pletka, and he called up and confronted an administrator, and he said, I just want to know what it is that you don't like about her. Is it that she's a woman? Is that she's a conservative? Or is it that she's a Jew? And that happened long before October 7th. Yeah. And you know, the fact that Jewish students have been putting up with this discrimination, have been living with this at colleges, at institutional levels, is something to be believed. In some ways, we should be grateful to these people because they have shown us their true faces.
So here's something I'm going to predict, that as bad as what's happening on the campuses right now, in the end, it's going to be a blessing. And I'll tell you why. Because this will be the death knell of the isolationist right. Because all these kids on these college campuses who they're trying to reach and convince that America needs to retreat into America first isolationism, they are being confronted with the face of evil on their college campuses. They are seeing what the pro-terrorist student body is like. This is going to be formative. They're getting engaged in the fight. Many of them who probably weren't even politically active are suddenly finding themselves having to push back, and they're seeing that's something that happens thousands of miles away on October 7th is manifesting itself in their midst on their college campus and preventing them from going to class and throwing death threats at them and canceling their graduations. And they are going to be energized by this. And it's going to change their worldview for the rest of their lives. And it's not just Jewish kids. It's going to be kids of all kinds who are watching this, and even the ones who are on the sidelines, who are, as Adam said, or who this is not their fight. I think a lot of them feel it is, and I think this is an opportunity for us to remind the world what kind of evil exists out there, and that America needs to confront that evil.
Well, Mark, from your mouth to God's ears, and to everybody else's ears as well. I hope you're right. I hope that silver lining is there. I have a hard time seeing it right now, but let's keep working in that direction. Folks, thanks for listening. Thanks for being with us. Don't hesitate to share your ideas and suggestions.
See you next week. Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.